Hey guys, Brian Schultz here with Cape Falcon Kayak, and I thought I'd take some time this afternoon to give you an update on where we're at with the new skin-on-frame St. Lawrence River Skiff design. But before we get into that, just in case you're new here, hi, my name is Brian. I've been building skin-on-frame boats for over 25 years. I offer online video courses and plan sets teaching people how to build skin-on-frame kayaks and skin-on-frame canoes, and very soon here, small sailing and rowing boats as well. So just to give you a real quick recap for anybody who hasn't followed this project so far, last year I decided to go on a totally new direction with my skin-on-frame boat building, and I started putting my efforts toward creating a car-toppable skin-on-frame rowing and sailing boat. And I decided to focus on the St. Lawrence River Skiff specifically because it's just such a versatile little watercraft. St. Lawrence River Skiffs can be rowed really efficiently. They can handle rougher water than a canoe. They can be fitted with a small or a big sail, depending on how adventurous you are. And finally, a lot of the technology I would need to develop to build this style of boat could easily be transferred into any small double-ender or even a small sailing dinghy with a transom, which is something I plan to add to this system in the future. So we built the first prototype for this boat last year, and then we took it down to Mexico for the winter, where we tested it for about 300 hours, dragging it up and down beaches, letting it bake in the sun on top of the car, and doing a whole bunch of fishing and just generally beating the heck out of it so I could see if there was anything I needed to modify in terms of durability or anything I wanted to change for better performance. Now, I should also mention that I put a Hobie Mirage pedal drive in this boat, which is completely optional. It's just something that I personally like to do because when I'm fishing, it's easier to pedal than it is to row. Now, I also want to mention here that that particular skiff was actually scaled up by 5%. And the reason I chose a 5% scale up is because it's the biggest size that I could make and still get away with building this with 16-foot lumber, which is a lot easier to find than 18-foot lumber. I was hoping that I could get away with that size being big enough for 2 people and camping gear for up to a week on the water. And it was technically big enough for that if we're talking about medium-sized people backpacking style gear in reasonably protected waters. Basically, anything you could do with a full-size canoe, you could have done with that boat as well. However, if we're talking about bigger people and heavier loads in more open water, I felt like that scale was just a little bit too small. So when I got back to the shop here, I scaled the next prototype, which you can see here next to me, up by 10%, which doesn't seem like a lot, but it actually represents a really big change in volume. So what I've got here next to me is the frame for that boat, which I just finished. And because it's going to be a few weeks before I can get a skin on this thing and test it out, I thought I'd give you guys a quick tour of this second generation prototype frame. I'm going to talk about what we learned and what I've changed. And then at the end of this video, I'm going to show you the plan set that we've been working on. And I'm going to give you an overall timeline for the release of those plans, including all the different sizes and the different modified versions that we're going to be offering. All right, so let's come in a little bit closer and take a look at this frame. So just starting out with some basic dimensions here. This boat is 42 inches wide, 15 inches deep, and 16 foot 4 inches long. So not a small boat by any means, at least compared to the other ones that I usually build. And just to give you an overall refresh on how this frame comes together, this is completely different than the way that I build my skin-on-frame kayaks and canoes. With my skin-on-frame kayaks and canoes, we start by mortising the gunnels, and then we build the deck frame and turn it upside down, and then we free bend in all the ribs according to a measurement formula, and then we wrap that with stringers, we lash it all together. It is the lightest and the quickest and the easiest way to build any type of small skin-on-frame boat. However, it has limitations. With that type of a system, you're never going to be able to reproduce the more complicated shaping that you see in some traditional rowing and sailing boats, which is why we took a completely different approach here. So the way that this boat gets built is we build the stems for either end, and then we build 3 laminated frames right here, here, and here. And we put those onto this bottom board, which is this wider piece that you can see in the bottom there. And then after all of that is fitted in place, we attach a pair of gunnels, which we laminated and mortised earlier. We cover the whole frame with stringers and we nail those to the frames. And then the next thing we do is steam bend ribs into pocket mortises that are carved on the inside of the gunnels. And then finally, we seal those in with cap pieces on either side to essentially create a gunnel that is laminated, not just in this direction, but in this direction as well, which really helps to control the more complicated shaping of this boat. Coming in a little bit closer, you can see this pedal drive adapter box that is designed to accept the Hobie Mirage drive. And that gives you a way to move the boat with your feet and not just with a pair of oars. Now, this is something I've been doing for a couple years now. I've been slowly expanding this systems to different ones of my boats. This one happens to be a permanent installation, which means that this isn't removable like it is in my canoes. But that's also nice because it's a little bit easier to build and it's lighter weight and more compact. And whether or not adding this to your own St. Lawrence River skiff makes sense just depends on how bad you need it. Because even though this thing is awesome and super handy, these drives are quite expensive. This is a little bit of a complex construction, and it also requires you to build a tiller and a rudder, and it's just a bunch of extra complexity to the boat if you don't need it. So that is the pedal drive box. Currently, I don't have instructions for these permanent pedal drive boxes in our pedal drive plans, but by the time we get this whole St. Lawrence River skiff released, I will have this addition as well, along with some updates to that system. Now, coming down a little bit further, you can see the bottom board that I was talking about earlier, and this is really the backbone of this whole system. This is one of the first things that gets built, and it gets put on top of the strong back, and then everything else gets built up from this piece. This happens to be 6 inches wide, 5/8 of an inch thick, and a bottom board like this has a lot of distinct advantages. One, it just gives you a really nice square surface that you can mount things to, but also it gives you a surface that you can mount armor to on the bottom of the boat, specifically high density polyethylene strips, which makes this thing a lot more draggable over rough surfaces. You can see on the top here, I've got the ribs, which are kind of weirdly connected to the keel with these screws. And the reason these are screwed to the keel as opposed to nailed like they are at the stringers is because to get the dead rise on this boat, there's a significant amount of upward pull on these ribs. And if I nailed these on, all these ribs would pull out, especially as the boat started to work over waves and whatnot. And I personally don't like the look of this little panhead stainless steel screw here. I would much rather have this be like a flathead bronze screw. The reason I haven't done that, however, is countersinking for that screw would weaken this rib even more at a place that already is a little bit weaker. And so I'm not 100% decided whether I'm going to keep this or whether I'm going to be willing to accept that weakening to make things look a little bit prettier. You'll just kind of have to stay tuned and see what comes out in the final plans. Now, if we come back a little bit here, you can see this is the laminated frame in the middle. Like I said, there's 3 of these frames that give the boat its basic shape, and then we wrap them with stringers, and then we flex ribs in along that shaping. And this one is actually, I think, 15 layers of Douglas fir. And the reason I use Douglas fir as opposed to red cedar on this particular boat is because this is a really big boat and it's going to take some pretty good stress. And I just wanted to make sure that everything was strong enough. When we move on to the next prototype, the one that is going to be significantly smaller, I'm going to switch back to a somewhat weaker species of wood just to keep things a little bit lighter. And then coming around to the outside of that frame, I'm not sure you guys can see this, but something I did differently this time is I actually pre-notched this frame for all of these stringers. That way, when we get to the assembly process, I don't have to be constantly holding a tape measure and this sliding around while I'm trying to clamp it. I just push the stringer into the notch, clamp it, just makes the assembly process so much easier, and it doesn't take that much longer to do. Now, coming up to the gunnels, you can see I've got that same 3-piece laminated structure that I've used on previous boats and also on my skin-on frame canoes. We've got a couple pieces of red cedar on the bottom to keep things nice and light, and then I've got a thinner piece of Douglas fir on the top, which is a lot tougher and helps to keep the gunnels from getting beat up so much. I mean, you don't have to use exactly these same woods. If you don't have access to red cedar, you could use any other species of long, clear softwood. It just might end up making this a little bit heavier. But really the big change in this assembly from the previous boat is that the outer gunnel here is 1/8 of an inch thinner, which substantially reduces the weight of the entire assembly, but more importantly, allows this piece to curve a little more naturally, which helped me to approximate the original lines in the front of this boat, which is something I'll talk about a little bit later because that's something that I really screwed up on the last prototype. Now, for the ribs for this, just like I always do, I used freshly sawn clear white oak because it's a strong, rot-resistant species of wood that bends better than any other species. If you didn't have access to this quality of wood, you could potentially do this with something like freshly sawn ash or locust. And there are a few kiln-dried woods that will also steam bend somewhat reasonably. Beech actually steam bends phenomenally if you cut it up and soak it for a while. It's just not the strongest or the most rot-resistant species of wood. You could potentially even do this with kiln-dried white oak, although if you were to do it that way, you would want to make the gunnels out of a stiffer species of wood because you're going to get a lot more outward pressure on the gunnels and you don't want to distort the shape of the boat. So as far as the actual scantlings, I reduced the width on this prototype by 1/16 of an inch, and I reduced the thickness by 1/64 of an inch. And I feel like that balances the strength between the stringers and the ribs a little bit better. You can also see that I nailed this together with bronze ring nails, just like I did on the last prototype. And the reason we do this as opposed to lashing like we do on our other boats is because this type of a connection, even though it's not as strong as a lashing, ends up locking this more complex shape together and making the boat a little bit stiffer, which is really important if you want to add a sail to any type of a small boat. So even though the nailing is actually harder to do than the lashing, it does have certain advantages. Now, coming to the ends here, the stringers are Western red cedar, just like they were in the last boat. You could make these out of any long, clear softwood. I just like cedar because it keeps things nice and light. You can see these are actually lashed to the stems. This is one of the only lashings that we use in this entire boat. And the reason I did this with lashing but everything else with nails is just because I felt like this tip was a little bit too thin to nail and not have it split apart. Now, if you look at the stem here, the stem's a little bit weird. It's got mahogany in the center and Douglas fir laminated on either side. Don't worry, I'm not going to specify this in the plans. This is just something that I did because I changed my mind on the dimension at the last minute. You could use any medium density softwood for this. Cherry would be a great choice. Now, if we come all the way up to the top of the gunnel here, you can see that I decided to finish this off with a shippy looking little tip here. This is pretty common on little wooden rowing boats. And I think for most people this would be an aesthetic affectation, but I'm not really one to chase aesthetics. The reason that I decided to leave this as opposed to doing what I usually do, cutting this off, is because I found last winter when we were down in Mexico getting the other boat on and off the car, there was a moment where you would have to grab the top of the gunnels and the bottom of the stem and kind of roll it off the roof rack. And if I had had this to wrap my hand around, I would have had a more ergonomic grip in that situation. So this makes things look a little bit prettier, but it does also have a bit of a functional purpose. You can see here that just like the last model, instead of having some pretty breast hook in here, which I admit would look way nicer, I've decided to just pound a 3/4 inch wooden dowel across. That way I can use it as a handle and also as a tie point to tie my bow line onto, whether I'm tying it to shore or whether I'm tying it down on top of the Jeep. And so even though this isn't nearly as shippy looking as a shaped breast hook, it's a lot lighter. It also helps to reinforce the end here, and I think it's a lot more functional. Now, taking a look at the seating arrangement, this is pretty much exactly the same as the last boat. Instead of having a solid wooden plank, which isn't very comfortable and tends to be quite heavy, I like to build a canoe style seat where we cover it with webbing, just like this one that you can see right here. It ends up being lighter, it ends up being more comfortable. It's a little bit harder to build, but if you've got a good system, it's not a big deal. Now, this particular seat is going to get pretty complicated because I'm going to be using it with my pedal drive system, which means that it's going to have a backrest, and also it's got this integrated tiller bar down below that controls the rudder. But if you're just building a rowing version of this, you would just have a straight up basic seat, put some webbing on it, and that's all you got to do. The whole thing sits on top of some white oak risers that get screwed into the ribs that have some backing blocks glued onto the back just to give these a little bit more support. Also, just so I don't forget to mention it, I've got a slightly different reinforcement for the mast partner this time. Last time I connected it to this frame back here, which I think is actually a stronger and better way to do it. It unifies the whole frame better and it helps to capture the stresses of the sailing rig. But if I was going to do that with the new placement of the mast up here, I would have ended up with just an enormously heavy block of wood. So hopefully this doesn't come back to bite me, and this is going to be a strong enough reinforcement so the sail rig doesn't add too much twisting force to the frame. So lots of little changes to the framework, including some pretty major changes to the building process that makes it easier to build. But the only major change to the actual shaping of the boat is in the front area right here. And if you didn't watch earlier videos, you don't know this, but on the first prototype, I could not have screwed this up worse. It ended up too narrow up here, too full down here. Not an enormous change in performance, but definitely noticeable and definitely not the lines that I was looking for. And the reason that happened is just because one of the disadvantages of being a skin-on frame designer is you can't just build a boat over a mold and then pop it off and expect it to hold its shape because it's not frozen with planking or fiberglass. What's going to happen is all the cumulative tensions of all these different framing members are going to try to balance each other, and that can do some really weird things to the shaping. And in my experience, the only way to compensate for that is to do iterations so you can figure out what changes you need to make during the framing process so you ultimately end up with what you're looking for. So what I ended up with in this case is much better than what I had before. You can see I've got a much finer water line down here. We've almost got a little bit of an hourglass shape, which is the correct lines for this boat. And then we've got a lot of fullness up higher. And that's really going to help when you're rowing or pedaling into a big chop. So you're not just plowing a bunch of volume into the smaller waves, but when you get into the bigger waves, the boat is going to engage this volume further up. It's going to lift up and over, and you're just going to have a much smoother ride, and also you're going to be taking less water over the bow. Now, one last thing I want to mention before we move on here is that in addition to the 3 different sizes that we're going to be offering this boat in, there's also a way to stretch it out if you want to. And this is really similar to what they used to do on the Adirondack guide boats. Basically, you would have a set of ribs that would make a shape that would just naturally end up being about 13.5 feet long. But then if they wanted to make it longer, all they would do is take the center rib shape and just add more of those in approximately 5-inch increments. Now, these are steam bent ribs, so it's not exactly analogous, but if you wanted one of these boats, and let's say you liked the 39-inch width of the smallest size, but you wanted it to be longer, instead of jumping up to the next scaled size, another option is that you could simply build another one of these center laminations right here, and you could put 2 of them in the middle, let's say with 3 feet or 2 feet in between them, and that would allow you to stretch the boat out and get a little more volume. Or let's say for some crazy reason, the biggest size that we're going to be offering is still not enough volume for you. Well, in that case, you could build another center frame and then you could spread those apart, let's say 2 or 3 feet, and you could make this thing just absolutely huge. So I think that's pretty much everything I have to show you on this frame for right now. So next up, why don't we head over to the workbench here, and I'm going to show you the plan set that I've been working on. And this is something I'm really excited about because it represents another huge change in the way that we create our boat building materials. In the past, our courses have been mostly video based, and then there have been various reference sheets for all the different specifications. But the problem with that approach is that sometimes people don't have Wi-Fi in their shop and they don't want to download the videos onto their phone. And if they watch the video the night before or even the morning before, and then they get to the shop, they might forget an important step. And so I figured this time around, I'm going to make a step-by-step plan page for every single video. That way you've got 2 different ways you can take in that information, which is just going to make your workflow faster and easier and more efficient. Now, before I show you guys this, you have to promise not to make fun of me, because if you're familiar with any of our plans at this point, you're probably familiar with something that looks like this. This was created by my partner, who's a professional graphic designer, and you can see it has everything that you would expect from a professional plan set. The information is clear, it's well organized, it's professionally illustrated. This is what our plans normally look like. but they don't always start out that way. So just to give you a little behind the scenes here, these are the plan pages and what they look like when I'm drawing them by hand. Not exactly the easiest thing to read, but you can see here just a ton of detail. And honestly, it's about the same level of detail as we've offered in our other plans. It's just organized in a lot more linear way, so you can follow along with these plan pages exactly one-to-one with the videos. So I'm just going to page through these a little bit just to give you a sense of the flavor of what these plans are going to look like when they're professionally drawn by Liz. And I've got a lot more information here on tool setup this time. Just huge amount of detail for every single step of the process. Overall, it's going to be about a 65-page plan set, which is pretty common for our plans, honestly. And then finally here, Liz really wanted me to zoom in on this page right here. I think because she wants to humiliate me. You can see this is our table saw safety and technique page for some of the more complicated cuts. And I think she's especially amused by these aliens that we have running the table saw. I think these will probably look more like human beings by the time she's done with this plan set. Okay, so that's where we're at as far as the plan set. And then as far as the overall timeline for this project, I'm still waiting for materials to cover the boat. So what I'm going to do now is hang this from the ceiling and immediately switch gears into working on the final prototype and starting to film the video portion of this course. And I'm actually really stoked about the final prototype because the final prototype is going to be the original size for this particular St. Lawrence River skiff, which is 14 foot 10 inches long, 39 inches wide, and 13.5 inches deep, which is almost the exact same specifications as one of my absolute favorite boats, which was the modified 14-foot long Adirondack guide boat that I designed many years ago after building a handful of traditional guide boats. That was a boat that I absolutely loved. It was so easy to handle and so convenient. It was great for one person with camping gear or for two people on day trips. It was great for fishing. Really, the only complaint that I had is that it was extremely difficult to build. Like, I never even considered putting out a plan set for that boat because I knew what would happen is that people would buy the plans and they would just never build the boat, and I don't want to take people's money for boats that don't end up getting built. Now, this St. Lawrence River skiff is also not the easiest boat to build, but it is much easier to build than that Adirondack guide boat would be, and it's probably about a quarter of the work of building any small watercraft out of strip-built construction. So it's still relatively easier. And I'm hoping that the final size is going to be a pretty close analog for what I enjoyed about that Adirondack guide boat. And then for people that need more capacity, we can offer it in that 5% scaled up size that we tested last year, or the 10% scaled up size that you see here next to me. And like I mentioned when we were talking about the frame, any of these sizes can be elongated a little bit if you just want a little more capacity. So obviously this is a massive teaching and design project, definitely the most ambitious thing we've done so far, but I'm just really excited about the doors that this is going to open, because once this system is out there, you don't necessarily have to use this to build a St. Lawrence River skiff. You could use this to build any small double-ended rowing and sailing boat. And next year, I'm actually going to be using this exact same system to create a small sailing dinghy with a transom, which I think is going to be really popular. So that's where we're at right now. As far as the overall timeline goes, I haven't taken a day off work since we got back from Mexico, and we will probably be working on this straight through November. And right now, the tentative plan is to release the whole system before Christmas. So thanks for watching this video. As usual, if you have any questions, please leave those in the comments below. And if you're interested in this skin-on-frame boat or any of our other skin-on-frame watercraft, make sure you check out our website, CapeFalconKayaks.com, where we have skin-on-frame building video courses, plan sets, and various free skin-on-frame resources. You can also find us on Instagram at CapeFalconBuilds, where we post photos and videos of whatever we're working on in the shop or whatever we're testing out on the water. And you can find that same content on the Cape Falcon Kayak Facebook page as well. So that's it for now. Take care. Be safe on the water. I will see you next time.